I'll go ahead and introduce myself. Jake, you can introduce yourself, and then we can get us started. So I'm Molly Breen, and the co-founder and CEO of Perigee, which is an IoT, OT cybersecurity platform. And before that, I was hacking IoT. When I say IoT, I'm talking about Internet of Things devices and OT, operational technology at the NSA. So between Jake and I, we'll bring in some of those examples. And Jake, if you want to go ahead and
Sure. I'm Jake Brodsky. I'm speaking here only for myself, not for any employer I've ever worked for or currently. So you may see other employers. I do not speak for them at all. I just need to get that out of the way. I'm just a registered professional engineer of control systems. And I've been doing this for about 20 some years. I got involved very early on working at a large water utility. And as a result of 30 years working there, I kind of know how water utilities go. And that kind of lets us towards this presentation here, A Day in the Life.
Great. Hey Liz, how do we change the slides?
Say very loudly, next slide.
Okay.
And then give me a second.
There we go.
There we go.
So one of the things we're going to point to is the hidden impact of when you connect things. I'm going to use a wood stove as an example. Not connected to anything. You supply the fuel. If you leave it alone, it burns down and that's it. No more heat. It's relatively safe, relatively. Contrast that with, say, a heat pump in your house. It's got all kinds of automation in it, and you've got all kinds of things going on in it, and it doesn't really scale down in the terms of simplicity. It needs infrastructure. It needs a lot of other things to keep it going. And that kind of describes how a lot of water utilities are today. Many of them are still coming out of the wood stove days. They're coming out of the days when we could actually you just had a well, and somebody would go periodically to that well and drop a bottle of bleach in it just to make sure it would be sanitary, and they'd switch to another well while you did that. They'd let it swirl around a bit, and then eventually they would pump water out of that well as well. So there's no real high tech here. Water utilities get pretty small, and that's what we're going to talk about here today. Next slide.
Hey Liz, next slide.
Very loudly. Did you switch it?
Oh, yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, we got it. Oh, no, you go ahead and take this one.
So an example of water utilities, they have lots of different sizes. There are different size scales too. So when you talk about this, you have to be aware of who's speaking and what they're speaking against. So the EPA has a whole bunch of different sizing. Big one that they do comes from legislation known as the Clean Water Act, I think from the 1970s, 1973, if I'm not mistaken. The Clean Water Act says anything below 10,000 population is small. Between 10,000 and 100,000 is medium, and 100,000 and up is large. And typically in water utilities, about 0.1% of the population served works in that water utility. So if you're working in 10,000 or less, let's say 10,000, so 0.1% of that is 10 people. That's 10 people working at that water utility. By the way, lots of water utilities are like this. Tremendous numbers of them. In fact, the EPA records something over, depending on what they're counting and how they count it and what they're including in there, up to 100,000 water utilities in the United States are small. So when you talk about water utilities, you have to remember there's a whole bunch of small ones, and it doesn't pay to make them bigger. That's the other big thing we have to remember. These don't scale up the way electric grids do. We don't transmit water from place to place. It's heavy, it's expensive, and if it's at the wrong altitude, it's even more difficult to move uphill. It uses a lot of electricity. When you think about it, it's sort of like hydroelectric power backwards. That's how much energy we're talking about. It's not small. So let's put this in perspective. You've got small utilities, you've got medium utilities. Now, sometimes you have a huge resource, like the Potomac River. Potomac River out here has about 2 billion gallons of flow every day, typically. It can be as low as 1 billion, it can be higher, but it can have a lot of flow going down that river. But that's the only major source of water for this region. So you have multiple water utilities pulling water out of the Potomac River. So you now have to account for an awful lot of distribution for the water utility, and that gets complicated. And when you start working with populations greater than 100,000, then you're in a totally different category of water utility. And the IT department for that is typically about 6 to 6 to 10%, typically 8% of the total company size. So at 100,000, you've got about 100 people and about 6 to 12 people doing IT. I want you to think about that number, because when we start talking about cybersecurity, the question then becomes, who does it? Next slide.
There you go.
Okay, amazing. Okay, perfect. So what Jake is talking about is showing up in the larger aspects of the data when we look at the overall market of water utilities. So we've got here broken down the statistics of what Jake was talking about, those really small water utilities, less than 500 people. It goes up to that medium size, that's less than 10,000 people, all the way up to the very large water utilities that are serving greater than 100,000 people. And then from that, you can look at the breakdown of what proportion of water utilities are falling among that size, and then how much of the population is being served by that type of water utility. And what you'll notice is that of all the water utilities, 92% of them are falling in that under 10,000 population or fewer category. And then of all the people that you have ever met, 78% of the people are being served by that last 8% of the really, really large water utilities. And when you start to peel back those layers that Jake was talking about, that means that for that 92% of water utilities, you roughly have about that 0.1% of employees that work at that utilities. Because of that, there's a ratio that is for every 10,000, let me think about it. The ratio it is 0.1% of employees at a water utility that are serving a population. So when you have 10,000 population people that you're serving, you've got 10 employees and 1 IT person. And so you can start to look at that. You only really get a full-time OT person when you start getting into that 100,000 population served or greater. And then we're going to talk about how that then plays out into the security landscape. So next slide. That's great. All right, so at this point you might be thinking, okay, well, if we're only really starting to see 1 IT person at a medium-sized utility, and then maybe you'll get 10 IT people at a really large utility plant, but then only then you'll get 1 OT person at that really large utility plant, you might be starting to think that then it would be the small utilities that would see the most cyber security incidents. But it's actually the opposite. You're going to see that there are the most cybersecurity incidents at the really large utility plants. What you're looking at here in terms of the data, it's 94% of the really large utilities have seen at least 1 security event. And that's in contrast to the really small utilities that 50% of them have never seen a security event. And why is that the case when we know that those are the ones that are under-resourced, don't all have the same headcount when it comes to IT, and they don't have they all have fewer headcount when it comes to operational technology, security experts in the field. So go ahead, next slide. Awesome. So we all know that when it comes to these larger utility equipment, and we're trying to peel back the layers and understand why are they the ones that are getting hit with more cybersecurity events, it comes back to the fact that they're going to be the ones that are the first to replace aging infrastructure. So that's going to come with more automation, it's going to come with more virtualization, more networking, and that's going to come at the cost of an expanding attack surface. Some of these example of attacks in the water utility industry are not updating your software, remote access, misconfigurations within the network. And you're seeing this show up in the data where you've got a 10% increase in the number of connected devices and an almost 10x increase in the number of cyber attacks hitting this industry. So then you start to wonder, if the entire industry is moving towards this world where the entire world is going to be connected, what does it mean for those really small utilities that don't have the same IT staff and don't have the same OT staff? And you might think that maybe there's something to learn from the large utilities, but it's actually the opposite. there's a lot we can learn from the small utilities and what they're doing and what advantages they have. And some of those advantages include the fact that they still have expertise in-house to run manually. They haven't introduced a lot of complexity. They haven't introduced a lot of remote access, one of these things that hackers, like myself beforehand, would love. And so this is where we can start to think about how do we not just bring what the larger utilities are doing to the small utilities, but what can the small utilities bring to the larger utilities? Go ahead and let comment.
Next slide. So one of the big things that we have to look at is what are they hacking in smaller utilities, assuming that they do get hacked. And most of the time, it's remote access. And this applies across the board. There's a bit of mythology about somebody who's critical to the plant, who saves the plant, halfway around the world, drinking some nice little drink with an umbrella in it, and he suddenly gets a call and says, we have a problem with the plant, and can you look at it and tell us what's going on? And of course they do, and it makes the glossy magazines, and everybody's happy, and it tells all kinds of wonderful stories. The backdrop to this is if you're doing that your employee can't take a bloody vacation without getting nagged, you're doing it wrong. You really have to start thinking about how much does this automation cost us? And what's it going to take to get enough people into the site? And that's something you need to ask. The automation does have higher overhead, and you need to re-examine whether it's worth doing. So when we first started automating engines in cars, we had all kinds of interesting problems when we did that. And we had to figure out what was worth automating and what wasn't worth automating. Was it worth having an automatic ashtray that came out of the car dash, with the push of a button or something? Probably not. Do we really need to automate everything in a water utility? No, we don't. Many things in water utilities don't change that much. Water quality generally, especially the well water, does not change dramatically from hour to hour, never mind minute to minute. It's not a dynamic environment at all. And you can store water. So let's take the Oldsmar, Florida case where everybody talks about, somebody pushed the PLC up to 11,000 parts per million of sodium hydroxide. Oh my God, he was going to poison everybody. Newsflash. It never could go there. If you hacked into your car and you told your car, I want to go 300 miles an hour, and let's say you put that in the cruise control dutifully says 300 miles an hour, you think you'd get there? The answer is no, you don't. And neither did that plant. That plant couldn't possibly get to that level of concentration. The fact that the controller accepted it is a concern, but at the end of the day, nobody's going to get hurt. The other thing they forgot about is all that water goes into a gigantic tank called a clear well, and the clear well stores that finished water to be placed in the distribution system. It's all good. The problem is they analyze the clear well water when it comes out. So no matter what you did going into the clear well, you can always waste the water coming out of the clear well and say, let's start over. Yes, it will be a problem, and yes, there will be lots of energy and money wasted, but guess what? It's a whole lot easier to catch it that way than to poison people. So that's how they operate. Many water utilities have multiple clear wells. So there are many ways of handling these kinds of problems, and it's in the infrastructure already. And that's the thing that most people don't recognize. There's no turning the chlorine up to 11. You don't get there from here. Now, there are things that I will not discuss publicly that you could do to a water utility, but the bottom line is that most of these things, if you keep them local, will actually be very survivable. And that's the message that the smaller water utilities bring to the table. Don't forget the manual controls. Don't add the complexity without any kind of return on the investment. You secure your operation. You know that if the automation fails, you've got the staff to keep things running. That's not going to be a huge issue. Now, in contrast, the larger utilities, their staff are eventually going to run out of gas because, my God, they're going to have to go around in pickup trucks to various stations and start things manually. So no, they've got a problem. At very large water utilities, typically that number is about 8 hours. You've got 8 hours and then somebody's going to have to go to sleep because guess what? They'd already been up 8 hours before, maybe doing their regular shift. After 8 hours, you're going to have a bunch of zombies on your feet. So guess what? Now you've got to find a solution. Within that window of time, that's what you've got. That's what we need to consider. And that's what we have to concern ourselves with. The largest of the water utilities, even the 100,000 population water utilities are not going to be that big a problem. It's the 1 million and up. And there are probably about a dozen of those nationwide. Not that very, very different from the electric grid. We don't serve huge populations because it costs too much water, costs too much energy to move the water around. So those are your big takeaways. And if you're crafting legislation, I'm not going to tell you what to put in there, but don't forget to include some sense of scale as to who this applies to, because if you don't, there will be a whole bunch of unintended consequences as people walk away from automation entirely and stop reporting the things that they used to report because they can't. So think about what you really want to secure and think about what that infrastructure looks like, and then decide whether or not this is worth doing. Anything else? Any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Going back to what we were talking about earlier, as far as hitting the major utilities, not the smaller ones, it's because their tax service is bigger, which I believe 100%. But how much does those smaller utilities not having the ability or the manpower to even investigate those things is playing into that data? Because that's where my mind went to first, is that the reason they're not seeing it is because they're not looking for it, because they don't have the time or capacity. I was just wondering.
The answer, that's a good point. They don't look. They don't have the people to look. There's no way for them to look because they don't have a SOC, and they're not going to pay for one. So we're basically going on a guess. We're blind here. However, here's what would probably have happened. Let's suppose the operator in Oldsmar didn't actually see the mouse moving around on his screen and entering in all the numbers that they did. What do you suppose would happen? Well, he'd find that value about 2 or 3 hours later and go, ew, okay, looks like somebody slipped a digit on a keyboard or something, and he'd fix it. And that's it. That's all it would ever be. The water would be slightly more alkaline. You know what? People pay extra for that in the grocery store. So it's not really that big a deal. This is very, very big, slow-moving stuff. They're planning things days ahead, and they're just not going to get into trouble that fast.
I think also like what Jake is saying is there's more opportunities where there's a human in the loop and some human oversight. Like, you know, like there's someone looking and being like, oh, that number looks like it's out of bounds. And the more you put in automation, for all the efficiencies that you get, you lose some of that human oversight that's going to be looking at that.
Sure.
Yeah, you lose touch also. And that's one of the things, as the utility size grows, you lose touch with everything else that's going on out there. It becomes more difficult for just one human being to know everything that's going on in the distribution system. And that's going to be an issue as the utility grows in size. Fortunately, though, they do have the resources. And that's one of the things that popped up in an EPA meeting that happened about, I guess now 6 or 7 years ago. We found out that most of the big utilities are doing a lot of things to stay ahead of the cybersecurity problem, even without standards. They're just borrowing them from wherever they can find them and trying to find things that fit. And it's square pegs, round holes as far as the eye can see. But that's okay. They're getting it done. The problem is it doesn't scale down. None of this scales down. So we have to come up with an alternative. And that's going to have to be one of the things that we talk about. And there are many opportunities for that. Yes.
I'm from the University of Houston, and about 5 years ago, it's pre-pandemic, so I don't know how long that really is. But the state of Texas legislature was very concerned with water supplies, municipalities, and honestly, hurricanes. So hurricanes drive water ashore, that causes all sorts of other problems, and they convened a panel, and they called me and some other people. We went out and gathered all the small utilities. Because when the legislature asks for somebody like that in a place like Texas, you instantly get the people to show up to a meeting. That was not hard. And honestly, the small utilities were much better set up to weather any disruptions than the big ones. Because their systems are small, they're simple, they don't have a lot of automation, they don't have a lot of places it can go wrong.
Yeah.
And the net result coming out of the report was pretty much for the state of Texas, yeah, you can mandate in this area if you wanted, you could spend money if you wanted, but it's almost impossible to get what you want because you want to have some assurance everything's going to be good. And the best thing that they can give you is they're actually paying attention to all threats. Their main threat was, of course, a biological contamination.
Sure.
Which, believe it or not, cow feces and drinking water don't mix. I don't understand. And hurricanes tend to mix everything. But I was actually very impressed with companies that serve 10,000 customers, that their one engineer, he understood everything about his system. Of course, now he couldn't stay long in the meetings because he was the one engineer. But I mean, I've also looked at electric and other places, and I found that the thought processes through the water people tended to be a lot further along than anywhere else.
Yes, they tend to be. It's because it is simple. And I mean, at the end of the day, most of this is simple. It's subtle, and there's some interesting things you probably would want to be careful about. But at the end of the day, this is something comprehensible by someone under a lot of fatigue and stress as well. And that there's something to be said for that. Yes.
So you mentioned standards. Texas legislature was looking at some of these. Is there a you must be this tall to ride the ride security benchmark that must happen in the water space?
There is very little. There are standards from the American Waterworks Association, but basically what it amounts to is they borrowed from all the other standards and say, yay, verily, here's the pile of standards of things you could do. And that doesn't get you very far because you still have to have somebody who understands the issue from soup to nuts. And those people are frankly rare. Even in large companies, even in the very largest companies, it's, you go to some of the ones that serve 25 million people like Southern California Water. And yes, they've got people that get this, but not nearly enough. So when we talk about scaling, like you might find in, let's say, the electric industry with NERC SIP, that doesn't exist in water. It probably should, maybe, but I'm not sure how you would scale it, and I'm not sure what you'd put in it. So, and NERC SIP has problems of its own. So let's just leave it right there,
Jake, to that point, one of the things we saw in the gas industry, right, was that kind of voluntary standards sort of approach with the TSA, the original TSA pipeline guidelines, right? And then recently, of course, with the TSA pipeline regulations, should the Waterworks Association go into some sort of a proactive regulatory framework, or should they wait until somebody actually gets hurt?
No, they're not going to. And honestly, it's got a lot more stability than most systems do. Water moves very slowly, very slowly. We make slow look fast. I mean, it is very, very sedate. However, once it starts moving in a direction, and this applies both to the water itself and the people who manage it. Once it starts moving, you're going to be in deep trouble if you try and stop it. The momentum is very, very strong. So what I'm trying to get to with this wild description is, I don't think anybody's going to get hurt overnight. Most of these utilities have enough problems with Mother Nature as they do with anything else. That's much higher on their list of things to worry about. That's, like, for example, you could have toxic algae in front of the intake. That will cause untold grief for a large water utility. So you have to be very careful about how you talk about this. It's a risk management effort. And in fact, the American Water Infrastructure Act of 2018 is a very good example of placing cybersecurity in context with all the other risks that you might have in this system. So there's a lot of things that you can do that you can evaluate the risk and deal with them accordingly. Every water utility is slightly different, and it's its own little provincial universe in there. So it's important to recognize that, when you make categories of things to do, if you're a utility of yay high to ride the Ferris wheel, that you look at how they put the utility together and what kinds of systems they're using in there. If you have a utility in a flat area, it's very easily managed. If you have a utility on the side of a hill, let's say you're out in Colorado near the Rockies, that's a totally different creature. You've got different hydraulic zones, you've got pumps, you've got storage tanks at different altitudes. Managing that water and staging it from place to place when the energy is inexpensive is difficult. And they actually play a great big game of chess when they do it. So there's a lot of back and forth that has to happen, and there's a lot of discussion that has to happen. And it hasn't been. The EPA, unfortunately, has very few resources to chase this down. And so if I were to say something to the community at large, the first thing is build a better EPA that they can actually talk to this.
Interesting.
You had a question? Yeah.
Going back to your table
Yeah.
in your slide deck, so would you say that it's safe to say prioritizing securing the sort of middle of your table would be the first step? I guess obviously this is a very interesting presentation, and I think eliminates some of the things the greater population doesn't understand water utilities, right? So just wanted to
Yeah.
see.
So her question was, do you think it's safe to say that maybe we should start securing in the middle? And the only thing behind that is if you didn't notice, it was this big barbell shape where there were a lot of small and a lot of large. So on one end, you could be like, let's have one size fits all and secure the middle, but we kind of all know that one size fits all has never really worked, especially in the context of security. So one thing that Jake and I were talking about in preparing for this is thinking about those larger utilities and how that might trickle down to the smaller utilities, because it's very likely that they will eventually look more and more like larger utilities, just in terms of makeup of technology and as they're replacing larger infrastructure or replacing infrastructure. Yeah.
Question, are you familiar at all with the Cybersecurity Commission's proposal around creating a reliability organization? And do you have any opinions on that as a potential policy way forward?
I would caution people that electricity is not like water when it comes to a utility. And things that worked for the electric grid may not perform the same way in water. It's something we have to be careful about. It's very easy to make this mistake. I get it. You know, everybody says it's a utility. How hard could this be? It's harder than it looks. Water utilities are very subtle creatures. So I would caution people to read it carefully. There are some things in there that I believe would be pretty toxic if you let them go as is. Do I think that that's it's not a showstopper? But there's some things I'd pull out if I were looking at it. And I don't want to talk about the details off the top of my head because I really don't have it at my fingertips.
Of course. Thanks.